Welcome back to the Right Wave Audio community. My name is John, and for this video, we bring you part 3 of our AV Receiver 2022 series, which is a deep dive into the amplifiers, amplification that makes up these receivers. Now, if you've been following us in part 1, we got into all the models that are out there, what the channel counts are, and what they cost and the cost per channel. In part 2, we looked a little deeper, and that time we looked at the specifications. And for that video, we looked into how the specifications are actually measured, over what frequencies, what the total harmonic distortion they were measuring that against, and try to do some apples to apples comparisons. It's not easy. For this video, we're going to look even deeper into how to utilize the amplifiers that are built in to these receivers. How flexible are they? Are they fixed and they can only be used for defined channels, or are they assignable? What about the pre-outs? What about planning for your future, or even making up those channels that are not addressed with the internal amplifiers as we get into more and more channels of processing that these receivers are capable of? So whether you're going to do expansion, you're going to upgrade your power, you're looking into adding additional zones or accommodating subwoofers in your home theater, this could be the video that helps you put it all together. So let's look again at where we're at now. Every time we get in and we do our research, we add or subtract models based off of things that are getting introduced to the market, our channel becoming aware of new models, and products that get discontinued. And we, in this past, was no exception. We found that some products, particularly from Sony, have been discontinued. So now we're at 69 models that fit into the category of active AV receivers out there in the market that are not discontinued, and they're not processor separates. And this represents 54% of the market with this revised calculation. And as we saw this before, we see the predominant distribution here in the 7-channel AV receivers. Now let's get into the topic for the day, which is how you're going to utilize this AV receiver. Whether you've already purchased one or you plan to purchase it, I like to think about the target layout for the room. And maybe you'll start with something modest like a 5.1 system, which you still get very good results from a 5.1 system. But as you move into immersive formats, how big are you going to go? Is it going to be a 7-channel bass, a 9-channel bass with front wides? How many channels are you going to put on the ceiling? Is that going to be 2, 4, or more ceiling or height or reflective speakers that you're going to utilize to make up your home theater system? And at what phases are things going to be added? Now, if you plan on keeping your AVR for a while, you want to think about, how do I utilize that AVR to hit each of these phases? So you want to see how many use it for phase 1, 2, 3, etc. And this may mean that in some stages you're using the internal amplifiers, and other stages you're using external amplifiers, a combination of the two. And it should be noted, as you get into the higher channel counts, that oftentimes the AV receiver has more processing capability than actual onboard amplifiers. And we discussed that in part 1 of this series. Now, what's very helpful is when the receiver has assignable channels versus fixed channels. So oftentimes you'll see fixed channels of being these terminals. This is going to give my front speakers, my side surrounds, my rear surrounds, my front wides, etc. But when you have assignable channels, you have flexibility because you may not need front wides. You'd rather use that amplifier for something different. And it kind of gives you that flexibility that you would otherwise only get from separates. But here we're doing it all in a single unit, and it can be very helpful. Now, I wanted to call particular attention to those that had a lot of assignable channels because I think that helps you out a lot. And the RipeWave audio database, it's growing, and I thought about how am I going to present all this data, and what I've decided to do is let's just focus in this video on some of the highlights that are captured in the database. Now, of course, if you're a patron or would like to be one, you have full access to the RipeWave audio database. So it would help me, and perhaps it would help you if you become a patron. So back to this. I put on the screen here several of these products, receivers that are out there that have high count. And let's take a look at these together. Now, of course, the one that has the most assignable, the most flexible assignments is the Focal Astral 16 at $20,000. Of course, you would expect it at that price point to have that flexibility. It is a pretty unique product. I believe it's based off of Storm Audio. And at this price point, it's the only one that acts as a receiver. The rest of them are processor separates. And this has 12 built-in amplifiers. And you can notice the backplane here that it doesn't even have labels. It just has numbers 1 through 12. So you can decide how you're going to use each and every one of those channels. Full flexibility. What comes closer and is a lot more obtainable for a lot of us is the Anthem flagship receiver, the MRX 1140 at just under $4,000. They only fix one of the channels, and that's the center channel. The manual goes into some detail about because it's not as a pair like the other channels out there, whether you've got front left and right, rear surrounds left and right, side surrounds left and right, height left and right, height 1, height 2, etc. So they explain that the center channel is fixed, and that leaves you with 10 assignable channels or 5 stereo pairs that can be assigned in different ways. So that's very helpful. Denon Marantz, what I want you to be careful about there, now they have a high counts in their upper models for assignability. 6, 8, and 10 channels that are assignable. But not all of those will be continuously active. It's limited because there's more terminals on the back of the receiver than there are amplifiers within. So take example here, this Denon AVR X8500HA, which is the same layout as the Denon anniversary model, the A110. And you start counting these 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 15 channels. But then I'm looking on their website and they're calling it a powerful 13-channel amplifier. Well, this doesn't add up. There's 13 channels of amplification and there's 15 binding post pairs on the back of this. So what I've determined as 2 of these channels at any given time must be inactive. Now this does give you some flexibility. You can put the receiver in different modes for different type of listening and environment. So you might utilize an extra set of height channels when listening to certain movies, and then go into another mode where you disable that height channel and now you're using rear surrounds instead of the height channels. or however you want to do this. But be careful, because a lot of these models have more binding posts than you can actually activate at a given time. So, but with that said, Denon Marantz have done a very good job of having a lot of assignable speakers, and you can see this written on the backs of these units. And so you can see on the Denon Marantz, the first 5 channels, they just say speakers, but then when you get to a surround back and then on up, it says assignable, assignable, assignable. So there's your clue that those particular channels can be repurposed for something other than what's labeled on the back of the receiver. On Anthem, it just says assignable speakers throughout, although there's that one note about the center speaker, as we mentioned. Now, here is the next thing I want to call your attention to, is the fact that most AVRs don't let you reassign the base layer channels. What we're talking about as the base layer channels, the front channels, the side surrounds, sometimes the rear surrounds, are fixed. What does this mean? Well, most likely you won't be stuck in the fact that if you wanted to put a more powerful external amplifier on your front channels, you can still do that using your pre-outputs. But what you won't be able to do is repurpose those front amplifiers built into your receiver for something else. They will be left unused. There are only a few receivers out there that let you repurpose those front, the side, etc. channels for other purposes. And of course, it's the Focal, the $20,000 unit. But looking past that, you have the Anthem models as we discussed, the 1140, the 740, and the 540. You could repurpose those front and side surrounds for the purpose of using an external amplifier for those channels. So this is a good thing. We just wish more models actually supported the reassignment of the base layer. Now, we talk about the assignable channels being a good thing, and it is. But it doesn't mean you're not left with some tough choices. And we find it even gets tougher as you get into the lower channel counts. You get into the 5 and the 7 channel receivers, because even though they might give you 2 or 4 channels to be reassignable, you're taking away from something else. So I picked a few models here to kind of dive into. For example, these are all receivers with 7 amplifiers built into it. So we have the Arcam AVR31, similar to their other models, the NAD T778 and the NAD T758. What they have in common is they have the 5 fixed, so that's your front, left and right, your center, and your surround, left and right. And then they've got these 2 channels that say above it, back, front, zone 2, height 1, height 2, and they can be used for any of those purposes, but not simultaneously. So if you wire up your height 1 speakers to this, what are you going to do about your back surrounds? Where are you going to wire those? Well, you're not completely stuck, because you still have your pre-outs, but that just does mean that you're going to use external amplification for those, because you don't have those extra channels built in on the amplification. But again, looking on these NAD models as well, they give you the output for front, center, and surround, which are the fixed, by the way. So once you've gone to the pre-out, doesn't mean you can reuse the front, center, and surround amplifiers for something else. they only give you one stereo pair, and then you have to make a choice of back surround, zone 2, height 1, height 2, etc. So those shared pre-outs make it additionally challenging. Now, the good news is for NAD fans, if you want more flexibility with your pre-outs, you can move up from the T758 V3i to the T778. So while this seemingly looks the same with 7 amplifiers, 5 fixed, 2 assignable, the 778 gives you dedicated pre-outs for surround back, for height 1, for height 2, and zone 2, which gives you that confidence that you can expand with using external amplification to bring in those extra channels. Otherwise, you could get stuck, right? So keep that in mind there. So you've got a similar situation with the RCAM models. They have some shared pre-outs there that can be used for front wides, for height, for subwoofers, etc. So, and they're only giving you one or one set, left and right, and that has to be set for your surround back, height 1 and zone 2, similar to the NAD example. And so these examples go on and on. Of course, if you have access to the database as a patron, you can explore this for yourself. So you'll want to play around with this. And I think part of the decision process is to determine not necessarily the count of how many external and how many internal, but where you're going to use, am I going to use the external amplifiers for my height channels or for my surround back? Where are you going to use them? Are you going to use them up front and not worry about leaving some spare channels behind? How are you going to go about this? So you want to play with the configuration here, and I show some examples here. Keep staying with the NAD. So the NAD does have 11.1 channels of processing for the 778, so there's more you can do. With the 758, it's limited to 7.1 configurations. So you do get stuck there. So I've got the color code. If it's orange, it's using the internal amplifiers. If it's blue, it's using external. And you can see here, some of the options you could go with. And so you could take something that's a 7.1.4 configuration and look at it different ways. Now, one thing that the NAD allows for in the 778 is by amping your front speakers, as a lot of models do, and we'll talk about that more later. That doesn't count against your processing. While it uses an additional set of internal amplifiers, it doesn't count to your 11.1 processing capabilities. So you can do that, and you can come up with a 7.1.4 configuration with the front bi-amped with the NAD, provided you have some external amplification. And in this one, for 6 channels is why I've got it shown. So in this one, we're using the front, left, right, and center, and the side surrounds using 5 of the fixed amplifiers, and taking the 2 assignable ones and using that for the front bi-amp, which is a configurable option for this model. And with the dedicated pre-outs, we're going to use surround back, height 1 and height 2 with 6 channels of external amplification. Now with the 758 V3i, because we're limited to 7.1 channels, it really reduces it down. You can get to a 5.1.2 configuration If you want more height, you really have to take away your side surround, so you end up with something like a 3.1.4 configuration and different things in between. But you can see how this becomes limiting if you don't at least go to 11.1 configuration. But if your rooms can't accommodate more channels, the models with less channels might be sufficient. Now, the other thing I've noticed is there's not a lot of AV receivers that support front wide channels. And from what I hear, a lot of people prefer adding the front wide channels over adding another set of height ceiling channels for that immersive experience. So it is rare, and so this is a subset. These are all the models out there that support front wides, either with the internal amplifiers or with pre-outs. But you have to pay attention to it, because not all the models support the front wides with the internal amplifiers. So what we've noticed here is, a few of them do it with assignable channels. So things like the Focal, of course, is assignable. The top-of-the-line Denon models, the top-of-the-line Marantz model, these are all assignable. Yeah, so you give up your height 3 channel, let's say, with the SR8015, and that becomes your front wide. And Anthem, you can reassign your front or your surround back amplifiers to front wides as well. The Anthem has a dedicated pre-out if you don't want to use the internal amplifiers, versus the Denon, Marantz, and Focal will use the shared pre-outs. So like Denon, Marantz, that instead of using height 4 or height 3, that becomes front wide on the shared pre-out. So there's some flexibility there. And then the Harman brands, JBL Synthesis, Arcam, and the OEM models they make for audio control, they have the shared pre-outs, these channels 13 and 14 out of the 4, 13 and 14 can be assigned to front wides. So that's how you can deal with that. If that is important with you, these are the models that you must select. If it's not on this list, I believe you're out buying another receiver if you want to expand to front wides. Of course, it could be a discontinued model that I don't have on this list, but as far as the actively sold models, this is the set. So you're spending at least just over $3,000 to get front wides. So it's an expensive proposition to take that plunge. Similarly, AVRs with the third row or fourth row of height channels are rare. And it's pretty much the same set of AVRs as the ones that supported front wide. So no big surprise there. These are the ones with more channel support, etc. Like on the Harman brands, instead of channels 13 and 14, it's channels 15 and 16 that gives you your third row of heights, but they're not supporting a fourth row of heights like Denon is. And I don't see the Marantz 8015 or the Denon 6700H supporting a fourth row. But that's not so common. So that's yet another thing to consider if you want to have a lot of height channels. Now let's talk about preamplifier mode. And the first thing I want to talk about here is really what is this and why do we need this? So the thing that I understand, and this I learned from watching Gene at Audioholics, is standard receivers will put out like 1.5 volts out of their preamp outputs. When you're driving at high volumes, this can cause clipping. By disconnecting the internal amplifiers from those preamplifier outputs, they can go to a wider range on the output that can go up to 4 volts and reduce the risk of clipping on those outputs. So you get a cleaner signal going out to your external amplifiers. The problem is we don't see a lot of receivers that support this. Now, Denon Marantz, they support this, but they only support it for certain models, so you want to pay attention to that. Now, with Denon Marantz, when you turn on preamplifier mode, it disconnects every single onboard amplifier. It's all or nothing proposition with Marantz or Denon. A couple of the Pioneer models, and this is specifically the SC-LX904 and the SC-LX704. Now, unfortunately, these are some of the older models in their portfolio from 2019, and don't support the 8K like the ones that came out last year. They're the only ones from Pioneer that I know of that support preamp mode, but what they've done is giving you a lot more flexibility on those models than Denon Marantz did, because they give you the ability to not just turn on all or off the entire set of amplifiers, but they even give you just to disconnect the fronts or just disconnect the base layer. I really like the way they've done this, because most of you are not going to use external amplifiers for every channel and make this a full standalone separate preamp. Or at least you're going to evolve to that over many years. And you'll start with using external amplifiers. I think ideally you want to do that first with your front channels. And with the front channels connected with external amplifiers, disconnect that by turning preamplify mode front on these Pioneers. And then when you add external amplifiers to your rest of your bass level speakers, go to the next level up to disconnect the front, center, and surrounds. And if you want to go full preamp on this, then finally you can turn them all off. I love that approach. I'd love to see more adopt that, but it almost seems that Pioneer has even abandoned this, and I don't see it on their sister brands, Onkyo and Integra. By amplification, now we talk about the ability to bi-amplify the front channels is widely supported. 85% of the AVRs out there allow you to bi-amplify your front, left, and right channels with the internal amplifiers. Now, of course, you can always do this if you have pre-outs on the AVR. But if you want to use those internal amplifiers, there are quite a few models that do allow this. And what I'm highlighting here, though, is there are a few models that actually go beyond just bi-amplification of the front channels, the left and right. There are some that actually allow you to bi-amplify the center channel as well as the side surrounds. And we've only got 6 models that I am aware of that allow this. And so, of course, Focal with its full flexibility. We have the Denon AVR A110 and the X8500HA that allow for that. And then the Marantz SR8015, the Denon 6700H, and the Denon X3700H all have this ability to let you cover your full bass layer, front, left, right, center, and side surrounds, as depicted in this diagram with the spaghetti wires. But you can see here it's using twice as many of the terminals for each speaker. here. Of course, you can't use it for your height channels at that point, but it's, again, speaks to the flexibility of some of these Denon Marantz models. Another widely supported feature is the ability to add a second or a third zone to the system. Not just powering your home theater, but an additional room of your house with this AVR. So it's a nice cost-effective method for many people. And 75% of the AVRs can do this for a second zone. So this is widely supported. And a few of them can also do a third zone. And so we've got a list here of those that support a third zone with the internally powered amplifiers. And I won't run through all these, but now we see a few other brands into the mix here from not just Denon, Marantz, and Focal, but Yamaha and Integra and Pioneer and Onkyo all have these capabilities. Now, I did call out a few models, such as the 3700H from Denon, the Pioneer VSX LX305, the Onkyo TXNR 7100, and the Pioneer VSX LX304 have a little asterisk on the Zone 3. And what makes these different is these are the only models that don't also have an associated pre-out for Zone 3 if you don't want to use the internal amplifier. So these models all support internal amplification for Zone 2 and Zone 3. Now, some of these are on shared channels, so you'll have to make some choices, but they all have pre-outs also for Zone 2 and Zone 3, not always dedicated again, but except for these 4 models that don't have pre-outs for Zone 3. So just pay attention to that as well. Now, speaking of preamplifier outputs, and these are really crucial if you do plan to expand or power up your amplifiers, who's giving you the most pre-outs? And about half the models, 55% of them, have at least 4 or more of the preamp outs on board. And so these are sometimes crucial because there's not as many amplifiers on board as the processing power of the receiver. But we're looking at a large list here of receivers that support this. The largest number of pre-outs is 15.2. Of course, if you take a look at the JBL synthesis, which also lets you configure some of those for additional independent subwoofers, up to 4 of them, that could then become 11.4 versus 15.2. But essentially, the largest set of pre-outs is 15.2, and there's actually quite a large number that support this due to the Harman brands that largely support it, and at least the one model from Denon and one model from Anthem have the 15.2 outputs. And then starting with the Marantz SR15, you've got a 13.2 output as well. Now, when we say .2 on the output, that doesn't mean independent subs unless we've indicated on the chart here specifically. So you can have a model like the Arcam AVR20 that is 15.2 outputs on the preamp outputs, but only really one volume control, one set of controls for setting that. So it's really a single subwoofer output wired in parallel versus something like the Anthem MRX 1140, which has 2 discrete subwoofer outputs. So we put those in bold wherever we saw those. Of course, 2 is the maximum on these receivers, except for 3 models. So those are the JBL synthesis, the SDR35, and its replacement, the 38, can have up to 4 independent subs. And JBL Synthesis is the only Harman brand that does independent subcontrol. And then the Focal, we can have up to 4 as well. But otherwise, these are either 1 or 2 independent subs in effect, even if there's 2 terminals on the back of the unit. But yeah, this, you can pause this screen and study the different configurations. I won't read through all of these; it would take too long. But it gives you a sense of, if I don't have enough amplifiers on board and I can't achieve what I want to do on board, can I make up the difference with my pre-outs? So this is an important chart to look at. And this chart takes you down to 7.1 outputs with the NAD 758 V3i. Now, Focal sits at the bottom, even it being a very capable and high channel count unit, only has 4 pre-amplifier outputs. So you better well be satisfied with those amplifiers that are built in, those 12 amplifiers that are built in, because they're only giving you 4 outputs for external amplification, whether that's subwoofer or your fronts or whatever you're going to use those for. Looking at the next set, and these are the AVRs with the least amount of preamplifier output, so 45% of the pool sits here, and I put the Focal at the top again, just for it kind of bridges the gap between these 2 tables. But starting with the Marantz NR1711, which is a $1,000 unit, this, even though it's a 7.1 processor receiver, it's only giving you 2.2 outputs. So what does this mean? It means it will output your front channels for external amplification, as well as 2 subwoofer outputs, which are run in parallel in this particular case. So all this page, you're not getting anything more than a front channel and a couple of subwoofers at the most on this page, other than the Focal at the very top. So all these are very, very key. And only the first few models, I think, is like 6 there. And a couple of them give you dual sub independence, like the Marantz 1510 and the Yamaha model there, which will give you 2 independent outputs. But then when you're getting into the Pioneer VSX LX505 and down, you don't even get the front output. So you're really dedicating yourself. I'm going to use the amplifiers built into this receiver because they're not giving me any outputs here. So that's what the 0.2 means. It's subwoofer only. And we see this on quite a few models. In fact, some of the last 3 are .1 with only 1 physical wire connector out on the back for your subwoofers. And that wraps up our overview for part 3 on studying the amplifiers for AVRs. Did you find this helpful? I learned a lot in the process here. This did actually take me quite a bit of time to compile this data, to study it, to do the analysis, to bring it to you. What are some of the design decisions you're making? I do feel like the AV receiver is probably one of the most complex things to purchase, because you really have to think and plan. I can imagine a lot of us out there have bought an AVR and got it home and realized, after looking at the manual and trying to get things to work, that it really didn't deliver the configurations you were hoping for. So we're trying to be able to understand this up front to avoid those mistakes, and you really shouldn't be embarrassed if you did. This is not an easy thing to put together. So your feedback would be useful here. Please add that to the comments and have a nice lively discussion. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this RipeWave audio community, And be sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified, and consider being a patron. And until next time, keep evolving your audio experience.